The interview that shook the world, Ibrahim Traore versus Piers Morgan. The studio lights were harsh, unforgiving. The cameras blinked red like warning beacons. Inside the glass walls of the set, the air was thick not just with anticipation, but with the weight of confrontation. Piers Morgan sat at his desk, a stack of cue cards in hand, his signature scowl cemented in place. The viewers knew what was coming. Piers thrived on provocation, and tonight, he had a new target. Ibrahim Traore, the young, enigmatic leader of Burkina Faso, had become a symbol of revolution to some, of rebellion to others. Western headlines called him dangerous, unpredictable. His defiance of foreign powers had disrupted the global status quo. And now, face to face with one of television's most aggressive interviewers, the world was watching. 3, 2, 1. The producer counted down. The show was live. Piers leaned forward. Tonight, he began with his trademark sharpness, where, joined by a man at the center of one of the most divisive movements in modern geopolitics. To some, he's a hero. To others, a reckless radical. President Ibrahim Traore, welcome. Ibrahim nodded once, slow, deliberate. He wore a simple suit, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. There was no flash, no armor, just the calm that often precedes a storm. His presence was unsettling, not because of aggression, but because of its quiet strength. Piers wasted no time. You've made choices that have triggered chaos. Decisions that have led to bloodshed. Some say you've risked your nation's future on principle. Do you feel no guilt at all, or have you just learned how to bury it? The studio seemed to hold its breath. Traore didn't flinch. He looked at Piers not with disdain or defensiveness, but with a stillness that stopped time. Do you really want to know? He asked, his voice steady and low. The question wasn't rhetorical. It landed with the weight of a moral hammer. For once, Piers paused. He faltered. The control he always held slipped, if only slightly. Yes, he said, recovering, his tone sharp again. I want to know. Don't tell me you've got nothing to regret. Everyone does. Traore clasped his hands gently. His gaze didn't waver. My regret? He began, voice almost a whisper, is not what you think it is. He let the words hang in the air like incense in a cathedral. Piers leaned in, expecting a calculated political answer. But what followed unraveled everything. My regret, Traore said again, and this time his voice trembled slightly, is that there are still children in my country who look at me like I failed to protect them. A ripple passed through the studio. A silence deeper than any awkward pause followed. No one moved. The control room froze. On the other side of the camera lens, millions leaned forward. Captivated. Children who look at me like I failed them. Pierce's mouth opened, then closed. His pen lowered, forgotten. Even Candace Owens, seated silently off camera, pressed a hand to her lips. A close-up caught her eyes glistening. I've never heard anything like this, she whispered into her mic, almost involuntarily, but wasn't done. I see their faces, he continued, eyes distant but voice clear, in refugee camps, in hospitals turned to rubble, in villages caught between foreign interests and our own broken politics. Children with hollow eyes, asking why we let this happen to them, and his voice cracked. I have no answer, that's good enough. Not yet. The moment was beyond television, it was human, raw, unscripted. The kind of moment history books quote decades later. Piers sat in stunned silence. But the silence didn't last long. Trying to recover, he switched gears, his voice rising. You talk about sacrifice, Piers said, reaching for his prepared lines. But Burkina Faso's economy is collapsing. You've banned foreign military aid. You've alienated powerful allies. Isn't this just political ego disguised as ideology? Are you actually helping your people, or are they paying the price for your pride? There was a shift in the room, tension rising again. The audience murmured. The translator looked uneasy, but Traore remained unmoved. And then, with devastating softness, he asked, do you think I sleep through the sound of children crying? The studio collapsed into stillness. Piers froze. The question wasn't meant to provoke. It wasn't a weapon. It was a wound bleeding quietly in front of the world. Traore straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket, gathering himself. I hear them, he said. Every night, I carry their voices with me. When I sit in meetings, when I sign new laws, when I speak to foreign dignitaries who ask for our loyalty in exchange for our silence, I hear them crying. I carry it not because I want to, but because someone must. His voice deepened, not with anger, but with anchored pain. If I don't carry it, who will? Even the cameramen lowered their equipment for a moment, stunned. This was no longer just a political debate. It was no longer about headlines or ratings. It was about the soul of leadership, the true cost of it, and what it means to bear the burden of a broken world. Across the globe, the clip exploded. It was posted on every platform within minutes. Hashtags like #TraoreTruth, Zinhal, the interview, and hashtag who will carry it trended for days. People didn't just watch, they wept. In that studio, under sterile lights and corporate scripts, Ibrahim Traore had spoken not as a president, but as a father to a wounded continent. And for the first time, the world listened because he shouted, but because he didn't have to. And somewhere in the silence that followed, Piers Morgan finally understood. This wasn't a man playing politics. This was a man carrying the weight of a nation's broken children and daring the world to carry it with him. The moment the world fell silent, Ibrahim Traore's truth, the camera slowly zoomed in on Ibrahim Traore's face. The studio lights cast a pale sheen over his skin, but his expression remained steady, composed, yet heavy with memory. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, quiet, but unmistakably unshakable. I stood one morning, he began, outside a school that had been burned to the ground. The words came slowly, each one heavy, like stones being laid upon the soul of everyone listening. There was a little girl, he continued, no older than 6. She was barefoot, her dress singed at the edges, her cheeks smeared with soot. She stood holding her brother's hand. He paused. The silence in the studio was deafening. She didn't know he was already gone. She just kept whispering, over and over again, he's sleeping. He's just sleeping. A collective breath caught in the audience's throat. The world seemed to stop. She looked up at me, Traore said, his eyes beginning to glisten under the lights, and she asked if I could wake him up. He looked down briefly, his composure beginning to crack under the weight of his own memory, and I couldn't wake him up. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the audience. Even Piers Morgan, usually quick to cut in, remained silent, his pen now idle in his hand. I carry her eyes with me, Traore said, his voice trembling but unbroken. Every day, every decision I make, I carry the eyes of every child who has ever looked at me, as if I was supposed to fix something I couldn't fix, at least not yet. He took a slow breath and added, that's why I fight. Not for pride, not for politics, but because I don't ever want to see another little girl begging me to wake up her brother. The words settled like ash after a fire, soft but suffocating. In their truth, the studio was frozen. No applause, no talking, just raw, aching silence. Piers Morgan's face softened, his combative demeanor momentarily washed away by the gravity of what he had just heard. For once in his storied, sharp-tongued career, he looked truly lost for words. His hand trembled slightly as he glanced down at his notes, suddenly feeling small, irrelevant. The cameras kept rolling. Traore sat quietly, hands folded, his gaze unwavering. He didn't fidget, he didn't blink, he simply waited. Then the audience began to weep, not loudly, but in quiet sobs and wet cheeks. They wiped their eyes, one after another. The moment had transcended politics. It had pierced straight through to the human soul. Online, the clip exploded instantly. That one line, "Do you think I sleep through the sound of children crying?" was reposted, quoted, and turned into a movement. Comment sections filled with broken hearts, shattered illusions, and newfound respect. I didn't know his story. Now I can't stop crying. This man is a true leader. Piers cleared his throat, but when he tried to speak again, his voice cracked. How do you keep going? He asked, struggling against the lump in his throat. When the burden seemed so impossible to carry, Traore looked at him, then let a faint, tired smile cross his face. It wasn't pride, it was pain, barely contained, and what he said next shattered the last of the defenses in the room. Piers leaned forward again, his tone harder now. Then why not step aside? He demanded, clinging to one last journalistic instinct. If the cost is this high, if it's tearing you apart, why put yourself and your people through it? Why keep going? The question echoed. Traore remained still. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched so long that some in the audience began to shift uncomfortably. Piers raised an eyebrow, waiting. Finally, Traore exhaled. Because my people never got to step aside, he said quietly. The weight of the answer crushed the room. When terrorists invaded their homes, they didn't get to choose. When their fields were set on fire, when their children starved, when their villages turned into graveyards, they had no escape. So why should I have one? A woman in the front row covered her mouth, already crying. The cameras captured her, shaking shoulders. Even Piers, speechless again, didn't move. Then, slowly, Traore reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. This, he said, holding it up, is why I don't quit. Everyone leaned forward, the audience, Piers, the millions watching at home. It's a letter, he explained, from a mother I met last month. Her son died defending his village from insurgents. He wasn't a soldier, he was just a farmer with a wooden rifle. She handed me this letter after the funeral. He unfolded the paper carefully, like something sacred, she wrote. He began reading. President Traore, if you must fall, fall forward so that even in falling, we know someone was still fighting for us. His hand trembled slightly. As he lowered the paper, he looked directly at Piers. How do I look her in the eye? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and tell her that I quit. Piers swallowed hard. His pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the desk. He didn't pick it up. At home, viewers were already reaching for tissues. Comments streamed in. This broke me. He's not just a president, he's a father to his nation. Then came one final question, soft, hesitant. You've spoken of children, and mothers, and sacrifice. Piers said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. But what about you, Mr. Traore? What have you sacrificed? There was a beat of silence. Traore looked down at the floor for a long moment. When he lifted his eyes again, something had changed. There was no anger, just weariness. Truth. I've sacrificed myself, he said. The words landed like a thunderclap. My family rarely sees me. My own mother prays every day that I'll live to see the morning. I have buried friends. I have buried dreams. I have lost sleep years of it. And some nights, I think I've even lost parts of myself. The camera lingered on his face. He was still young, but his eyes were old, burdened with grief too deep for any man his age. But if that's the price, he said finally, for a free Burkina Faso, for children who can go to school without fear, for farmers who can plant without fire raining from the sky, then I will keep paying it. The studio was silent. The world for a moment was silent, and across that silence, the truth of a leader echoed not in thunder, but in a whisper that would never be forgotten. The interview that shook the world. Ibrahim Traore's unforgettable words. Tears shimmered in Ibrahim Traore's eyes. Now, but he didn't look away. His gaze stayed steady, cutting through the silence like a warm blade. The studio audience was frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. Every face, every heart in the room, was caught in the grip of a moment that felt holy. Across from him, Piers Morgan sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. His hands no longer clutched his notes. They lay motionless on the desk. His lips quivered as he whispered something so soft. It might have been mistaken for a prayer. I've never heard this before, he said. 6 simple words, but they rang out like cathedral bells in a room gone utterly still. They echoed through the studio, through earpieces, through the hearts of millions watching around the world. Behind the cameras, producers froze. Technicians forgot to breathe. Even the makeup artist, crouched quietly in the corner, clutched a tissue to her cheek, tears silently falling. Ibrahim Traore's voice, calm, scarred, unwavering, still lingered in the air like a benediction. I've sacrificed myself. The silence afterward said everything. It wasn't the kind of pause that begged for attention. It was reverent, eternal, a silence reserved for the sacred. It was the silence of truth, laid bare. Piers looked at Traore differently now. The sharpness in his eyes had melted. The fire he was famous for had faded. What replaced it was a softness not even Piers himself expected, an expression of something dangerously close to respect. He leaned forward, gentler now, his voice no longer charged, but careful. Do you ever regret it? Traore inhaled deeply, the air seeming heavier than before. His shoulders sagged not from defeat, but from the weight of leadership no man should ever carry alone. I regret that they still suffer, he said, the words landing with quiet finality. I regret that I haven't done enough yet. But, do I regret standing here, carrying this fight? No. His voice sharpened, not with anger, but with conviction. Because if I leave, who will they have? The audience broke emotionally, spiritually. People reached for tissues, wiped their faces with sleeves. Even the cameramen struggled to hold steady. One camera tilted ever so slightly as the operator's hands trembled. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was an awakening, and for the first time in his long, confrontational career, Piers Morgan didn't interrupt. He didn't push. He didn't pivot. He just sat there silent, absorbing. From the back of the studio, a voice emerged. A whisper, just loud enough to be heard. He's telling the truth. No one turned to see who had said it. It didn't matter. That single, quiet declaration cracked the emotional dam wide open. The audience stirred. Murmurs of agreement swept through the seats. Some nodded. Others placed hands over their mouths. A young woman in the second row sobbed into her sleeve. Her mascara-streaked face crumpled in silent grief. Traore saw her. So did Piers. And then, breaking all rules of televised journalism, Piers turned to the audience. What do you see? He asked softly. When you look at him? A man stood up, middle-aged, glasses fogged from emotion, voice shaking. I see someone who cares more about strangers than our own leaders care about us. The room filled with murmurs. Someone said, he's a hero. Another said, he's hope. Traore didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply folded his hands in his lap and listened, letting the people's voices rise like a choir of truth. Then came a voice. This time not from the audience or Piers, but through Piers's earpiece. The director. We're out of time. Wrap it up. But Piers didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't acknowledge the command. He just looked at Traore for a long, silent moment. Then, ignoring the countdown in his ear, he asked, if the whole world was listening right now, what would you say to them? The breath caught again. Not just in the studio, but around the world. The camera zoomed in. Traore looked straight into the lens, eyes like stone and sky, voice like a hymn. The people you ignore today, he said slowly, will be the ones who bury your children tomorrow. A hush. So choose love. Choose them. Choose humanity. Before it's too late. Silence. Complete, soul-deep, seismic silence. Piers blinked rapidly. His mouth opened, but no words came. His throat clenched, and all he could do was nod, defeated and moved by the weight of something far bigger than himself. Within minutes, the internet ignited. Clips of Traore's final words tore across the digital world. #ChooseHumanity, #Truth over politics, #TRAORE trended at number 1. News sites plastered headlines across their front pages. The sentence that shook the world. On YouTube, millions clicked replay, again and again. Not because they missed it, but because they couldn't believe it was real. In homes across the globe, people cried, some alone in the dark, others beside their children, wondering what kind of world they were building. A fire had been lit, and it was spreading. Back in the studio, Piers sat alone. His guests had gone. The cameras stopped rolling, but he remained, staring at his hands. The man known for tearing apart politicians had nothing left to say. Around him, producers answered, buzzing phones, media agents huddled, assistants scrambled to process what had just happened, and still, Piers sat there in silence, his heart cracked open. Outside, the studio emptied slowly. The audience filed out, sniffling, wiping their faces. They weren't just leaving a show, they were leaving a sermon, a reckoning, and Traore. He slipped out quietly through a back door into the cool London night. He didn't wait for fanfare or headlines. He didn't want applause, but he didn't get far before a woman stepped from the shadows and took his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll never forget tonight." He smiled softly, just once, then kept walking. What he didn't know, what he was just beginning to sense, was that he had just started something far bigger than himself. That same night, thousands of miles away in Burkina Faso, joy burst into the streets. Children huddled around radios. Families gathered before flickering TVs. His words, carried by satellite and spirit, reached the very people he fought for. In homes built from mud and sweat, voices chanted his name, not like a politician, but like a father, a protector, a symbol of hope. And in the eyes of the next generation, there flickered the first light of a different Africa, sovereign, seen, and unafraid. The second interview, a nation's soul on display through the streets of Ouagadougou. People shouted his name. Children ran barefoot over the red dust, waving scraps of cloth like flags. Women ululated, men raised fists in the air, and all of them echoed the same cry. He spoke for us. He told them the truth. The voices swelled into a wave of love and defiance that rippled far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. At a modest home tucked away in the outskirts of the city, Ibrahim Traore's mother sat quietly in front of a small flickering television. Her back was straight, her eyes locked on the screen, her hands folded in prayer. She watched the replay of her son's interview, his voice calm, his eyes filled with unspeakable sorrow and strength. She wept silently, each tear a testimony to a lifetime of sacrifice. Then she picked up her old mobile phone and typed a simple message. "My son, you have carried our pain into the light. Be strong. We are with you." Thousands of miles away, in a quiet London hotel room, Ibrahim read the message alone. He held the phone to his chest for a moment. Then the calm mask he had worn all day cracked. He bowed his head, buried his face in his hands, and cried. He wept not for himself, but for the children he couldn't save yet. For the mothers still waiting for their sons to come home. For the fathers crushed beneath the weight of war. And for the villages that still slept hungry beneath the stars. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if it had been enough. But then, as dawn began to stretch across the gray London sky, he rose, wiped his tears, and stood tall again. The world was still, watching, and so was hope. The next morning, as he zipped up his jacket, his phone rang. The caller ID read, "Piers Morgan." Ibrahim answered. On the other end, the voice that once barked challenges now carried hesitation. "Ibrahim," Piers began, his words halting. I just wanted to say thank you." There was a long pause. "You didn't just speak to me last night," Piers continued, his voice cracking. "You spoke to the world, and I was wondering, would you come back? There are more things I think people need to hear from you." Ibrahim was quiet for a moment, then replied with gentle firmness, "I will come back, Piers," he said, "but only if this time, you're ready to listen, not just to ask." Another pause. Then came Piers's voice, softer now. "I'm ready." That evening, under a moody London sky, a crowd had already gathered outside the studio long before Ibrahim arrived. Rain drizzled gently, but no one moved. They held handmade signs in trembling hands. "You speak for us. Truth still matters." "Thank you, Ibrahim." When Traore stepped out of the car, applause erupted. Some people simply stood in silence, hands over hearts. Others whispered prayers. The scene wasn't about fame. It was reverence. Inside the studio, Piers was waiting, not with the posture of a man prepared for battle, but of someone humbled. His eyes, tired but kind, met Ibrahim's. He extended his hand, and this time, it wasn't a formality, it was respect. As they walked toward the studio lights, Ibrahim slowed at the door. He took a deep breath. In his mind, he saw the faces of his people, tired farmers tilling cracked soil, children with empty bowls and wide eyes, soldiers and villagers buried side by side in shallow graves. He saw mothers with no news, fathers with no hope. And then he stepped through the door. The lights blazed again. The audience hushed. This was no longer a talk show. This was testimony. This was reckoning. Piers, his voice unusually fragile, began. "You spoke last time about humanity, but tell me, why does it matter if the world listens?" People don't change. The silence was immediate, weighty. Ibrahim sat still. His hands rested on his lap. He didn't rush, he just let the silence breathe. Then with a voice, quiet enough to make the room lean in, he answered, "Because even if the world doesn't change," he said, "you can." Piers froze, his mouth opened slightly, but no words came. The audience collectively inhaled. "You see," Ibrahim continued, his voice like wind over water, "change doesn't start with governments. It doesn't begin with nations or borders. It begins here," he pointed gently to his heart, "with one person, one choice, one moment of truth." The room seemed to bend with emotion. A young woman in the front row wiped a tear. A man 2 rows behind her let out a shaky breath. Piers lowered his gaze. He had no comeback, just silence. And in that silence, a million hearts watching from kitchens, buses, living rooms, and cafes around the world broke wide open. In that moment, the noise of politics faded, the drama dissolved, and only humanity remained. When the segment ended, the applause didn't stop. People rose to their feet, not to cheer, but to honor. Some came forward just to press a hand to Ibrahim's shoulder, to whisper thank you, to pass him a note. Their eyes carried the weight of their own stories. Piers stood too. His voice cracked as he stepped closer. "Thank you, Ibrahim. I'll never forget this." Ibrahim smiled gently and said, "It's not about me, Piers, it's about what you do next." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The sky had opened just slightly, revealing a sliver of silver light. The crowd from earlier had stayed, still waiting. They didn't cheer this time. They simply watched. Watched a man who had carried their pain into the light, who had dared to speak a truth so unshakable it made the world pause. Ibrahim waved, quietly. His eyes, red but hopeful, scanned the faces, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, the world was ready to change, not because of power, not because of politics, but because someone, somewhere, chose to listen. If this story touched you even for a moment, please don't leave in silence. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below about what moved you most. Let's keep this conversation alive. Let's keep choosing truth over politics and humanity over headlines. Because change doesn't start with the world, it starts with us.